Hey guys, tonight we slip into the warm August air of 1945, and you find yourself standing among thousands in Piccadilly Circus. The crowd buzzing so loudly, it feels like the pavement trembles beneath your shoes. Japan has just offered its surrender. The radios have shouted the news across the aisles, and London erupts in cheers that almost drown out the distant memory of sirens and falling bombs. Searchlights sweep the sky like excited children waving sparklers, and strangers cling to one another as if all of you survived something you probably shouldn't have. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through that crowd, feeling the mixture of triumph and exhaustion hanging in the air, a kind of national exhale after 6 years of tension. But as your footsteps drift across confetti-scattered stones, you start noticing something beneath the jubilation. People celebrating victory without quite knowing what comes next. The buildings around you, some patched, some burnt-out shells, stand as a reminder that peace doesn't magically fix a country that has hollowed itself out to win a war. A mainstream fact settles in your mind. By 1946, Britain owes around $40 billion to foreign creditors, a sum so vast it makes your own student loans look like pocket change. Historians still argue whether the scale of this debt or Britain's wartime overextension mattered more in its decline. But either way, you feel the weight of both pressing down. You hear a man beside you brag that Britain has come through like a lion, but you can't help noticing the frayed cuffs on his jacket, the way he limps from an injury that probably wasn't heroic so much as painfully ordinary. And that's where you catch a quirky little tidbit whispered by a cheerful old woman that some London pubs are serving Victory Ale, made from whatever random grains they can scrounge. A kind of Frankenstein brew that might technically be alcoholic but tastes like disappointment with a hint of victory. She warns you not to try it unless you enjoy flavor combinations that violate the Geneva Conventions. The night carries you forward, and you slip into a gentler part of the city, where reconstruction plans sit half-drafted on government desks and architects argue whether to restore London to its old pre-war charm or rebuild as a bold modern capital. Historians still argue whether post-war reconstruction was handled too cautiously or too ambitiously, but you can already sense that Britain doesn't quite know what it wants to be now that the war is over. It feels almost like waking from a bad dream, only to realize you've overslept, you're late for work, and your house is on fire. But don't panic. The fire brigade promises to get to you, eventually. You wander past a rationing office, the queue still long even on this night of celebration. Victory hasn't removed the need for coupons, and the people waiting in line understand that austerity is about to become Britain's unwelcome roommate. Bread, cheese, petrol, you name it, there's probably a shortage of it. Someone jokes that rationing feels like that friend who says they're just crashing for a night, and then stays until 1954. You chuckle, because you suspect they're not wrong. From there, you find yourself walking beside the Thames, staring at its calm, dark surface. The river doesn't celebrate. It just moves, like it has for centuries, carrying the reflections of battered warehouses and damaged bridges. You lean on a railing and realize that, despite the cheering crowds, despite the street parties, Britain is a nation standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into a future it didn't prepare for. A mainstream fact slips over you like a cool breeze. Britain's industrial production has collapsed, and the country imports far more than it exports. You can't run a global empire when you can barely feed your own citizens. A man nearby lights a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind with cupped hands. "We won," he says quietly, "but I'm not sure what we won with." You think about that for a moment, realizing you've heard variations of the same sentiment across the city, that victory doesn't erase exhaustion. Britain fought the war until its bones creaked, and now it hopes the Anglo-American loan and the coming Marshall Plan will patch things up. But you sense that becoming dependent on anyone, even an ally, gnaws at a country that still remembers when it painted half the world pink on maps. You make your way past the Foreign Office, where lights burn late into the night. Inside, civil servants tally debts, draft letters to Washington, and argue over how to maintain global influence when Britain's wallet is functionally empty. There's a rumor floating around, your quirky tidbit of the hour, that someone joked about sending King George VI to America on a goodwill tour to charm Congress into giving a better interest rate. You suspect this is a joke, but with Britain's finances the way they are, you wonder if anyone would have actually tried it. Walking onward, you glide back into residential neighborhoods, where curtains glow faintly behind blackout blind frames that people haven't yet bothered to remove. Habits of wartime cling like damp clothes. Even with peace announced, the fear of air raids lingers in subtle ways. Doors kept double-locked, windows taped, radios left on, as if danger might still knock after midnight. Historians still argue whether this lingering anxiety helped push Britain toward a welfare state out of collective trauma, or whether it was simply the economic necessity of a country too tired to argue about social reform. You pause by a house where a young couple stands in their doorway, holding each other, maybe for warmth, maybe for reassurance. You overhear them discussing the future, better jobs, maybe a holiday someday, perhaps children, when the world seems less unsteady. Their quiet hope feels fragile, like glass resting on a wobbling table. And yet there's strength in it too, the kind that helped them survive the Blitz. Rationing, separation, loss. You breathe in the moment and realize that Britain's story from this point onward isn't about collapsing overnight. It's about stumbling, refusing to fall, and trying to find balance again. As dawn begins to wash the rooftops with soft light, you feel the mixed heartbeat of a nation. Proud, weary, victorious, and deeply unsure of what comes next. And as you watch the first buses rumble into the streets, you sense that this victory night, brilliant, noisy, unforgettable, is also the threshold of something far more complex than war, the slow unraveling of an empire. You follow the fading glow of that victory night into the next morning, when the city wakes not with trumpets, but with the dull ache of a hangover. Except the headache isn't from champagne, it's from numbers, big numbers. Numbers so catastrophic that even your high school math teacher would excuse you from showing the work. You walk past the Bank of England, its gray stone walls solemn and heavy, as if they too feel the weight of a government that has spent everything it had, and then borrowed everything it didn't. The truth settles over you like the persistent London drizzle. Britain may have won the war, but it has emerged bankrupt, exhausted, and clutching a victory that feels a little too expensive. You move through streets lined with buildings still hollowed by bombs. Windows patched with plywood stare at you like tired, half-awake eyes. And you sense immediately that scarcity is the new normal. Rationing continues. Fuel is precious. Food queues wrap around corners like sleepy serpents. Historians still argue whether Britain's economy was already doomed before the war, or whether the war merely accelerated the collapse that imperial overstretch had set in motion. But either way, you feel the way people have learned to measure hope in teaspoons. A mainstream fact echoes in your mind as you step past a rationing notice. Britain, in 1946, owes roughly $40 billion to foreign creditors, an impossible sum for a country whose exports have collapsed and whose industries lie twisted beneath rubble. There's the quirky tidbit that British families joke about austerity chic, repurposing military blankets into curtains or dresses, which might be thrifty or might be fashion trauma, hard to tell. One tailor even claims he can make blitz-resistant trousers, though you privately suspect they're just uncomfortable. As you walk, you brush fingertips across the bricks of a charred wall, feeling its rough texture. This city burned and survived, but the scars are everywhere. Roofs missing tiles, staircases leading to empty spaces where homes once stood, chimneys rising like skeletal fingers. Your shoes crunch on broken glass and warped metal, reminders of nights when the Luftwaffe turned whole streets into firestorms. People begin rebuilding, slowly, but the pace is halting, like someone rising from bed too quickly after an illness. You drift into a housing estate where temporary, prefabricated homes, prefabs, dot the landscape. Families live inside these cozy, metal-framed boxes with surprising pride, even though they're meant to last only a decade. A woman passing by tells you she loves her prefab because the kettle actually boils in under 20 minutes, and she laughs about it as though speed feels like a luxury after 6 years of war. You learn that prefabs become so beloved that some end up standing for generations, which is one of those quirky tidbits that makes you wonder whether temporary things always stay temporary. As you wander farther, you see that money, or the lack of it, is the ghost that follows Britain everywhere. You overhear civil servants cracking jokes about how the nation's finances resemble a drunk man who has lost his wallet but insists on buying everyone around. They try to hide the panic with humor, but the Anglo-American loan of 1946 is not a joke. It's lifeline money, oxygen money, please don't let us collapse entirely money. And tied to it are quiet strings that bind Britain more closely to the United States. You step into a government office where officials debate which industries to nationalize: coal, steel, railways, electricity. The idea is to harness unified control to rebuild more efficiently. Historians still argue whether these nationalizations represent bold social progress or desperate triage on a dying patient. You glance at the piles of paperwork on desks and understand why no one has time to answer. Everyone is simply trying to keep the economy breathing. Pacing down Whitehall, you notice how often conversations mention the Americans. America is everywhere. Its dollars, its supplies, its influence. With the Marshall Plan soon to launch, the US stands ready to pour billions into European recovery. But the role comes with power dynamics that Britain tries, with diminishing success, to hide from itself. You hear a joking quip: "We used to loan money to America. Now we write them thank you notes." You chuckle, even while feeling the sting behind the humor. Crossing the Thames again, you watch the barges moving sluggishly along the river, carrying bricks, timber, coal, small lifelines feeding the city's recovery. Dock workers shout instructions, and cranes swing overhead like weary giants. You reflect on a mainstream fact: Britain's pre-war trade networks have fractured, and markets once dependent on the empire now look to the US for goods and investment. The imperial economic engine sputters like an old lorry with a fading clutch. You drift into a factory district where smokestacks idle instead of roaring. Machines sit unused, their belts slack, their gears stiff. The air smells of dust rather than output. A foreman waves at you with a stained rag and mutters, "We'll get her running again, don't you fret." But the way he says it carries the tone of someone convincing himself rather than you. There's a quirky tidbit circulating among workers, a rumor that engineers have begun reusing old tank armor to patch boilerplates because it's just lying around and about the right shape. History meets recycling, apparently. You slip into a canteen where workers sip watery tea and complain about shortages of metal, of rubber, of energy. And as you listen, something becomes clear. The war didn't just drain Britain financially, it drained its confidence. Maintaining the world's largest empire required not only wealth, but also belief. Belief in Britain's stability, its authority, its inevitability. Now, the veneer is cracked. Beneath it lies a nation trying desperately to stand tall while its knees shake. Yet even in the gloom, there is resilience. A child skips past you, waving a small Union Jack made from newspaper clippings glued to a stick. A bus conductor hums a tune as he punches tickets. A group of elderly men sit on a bench sharing jokes, each one worse than the last, and they laugh anyway. You smile, realizing this place has always thrived on humor that borders on stubbornness. And as you wander through the heart of a nation struggling to rebuild itself, you feel the quiet truth settling around you. The war may be over, but Britain's most difficult journey is just beginning. A journey not of battlefields, but of balance sheets, political shifts, and an empire beginning to slip through its fingers. You drift from those crumbling streets into a world that is suddenly much larger than Britain. So large, in fact, that this island nation seems to shrink a little more each time you blink. As you wander through the corridors of Whitehall, the conversations you overhear no longer revolve solely around rationing or reconstruction, but around two new giants who have stepped onto the stage with booming footsteps: the United States and the Soviet Union. You sense it immediately. Britain, once the loudest voice in the room, now speaks a little softer, hoping not to be drowned out. You glide into a dimly lit planning room where maps hang like tired skins on the walls. Ministers huddle around them, tracing fault lines forming across Europe. A mainstream fact drifts through your thoughts. By 1947, the US and the USSR are clearly the world's two superpowers, and everyone knows it, even if Britain won't say it out loud yet. Historians still argue whether Britain ever truly accepted this shift or whether it clung to illusions of parity far longer than it should have. But the weight of change presses on the room like humidity. Someone taps a pencil against a chart showing military spending, and you lean in to see the numbers bleeding downward. Britain simply cannot keep up. The empire is expensive, the debts are enormous, and the country's industrial output is limping. Meanwhile, the Americans are thriving, the Soviets are expanding their influence, and Britain sits somewhere awkwardly in the middle, like a former star athlete who still dresses for the team but can't run like they used to. A minister quips that Britain is becoming the world's most experienced advisor, which is polite speak for, "We're no longer in charge, but still pretending we are." You drift through a war room where officers debate what it means to maintain global bases when the Treasury can barely afford tea bags. One officer insists Britain must hold on to its role as world policeman. Another counters that even the night watchman duties are too expensive now. A quirky tidbit slips into your ear. Someone jokes that if America is the new superpower, Britain is the superpower's slightly underpaid but very polite roommate. You smirk because it's a joke that feels only half joking. As you step outside, the wind carries the sound of Big Ben striking noon, a confident chime masking the fact that Britain's real power now lies in alliances rather than dominance. You walk along Downing Street, sensing how dependent Britain has become on American loans, American economic revival, and American security commitments. The Anglo-American relationship is warm, but it has a quiet imbalance underneath. Like a friendship where one person always picks up the check. You move past a newspaper stand where headlines scream about the Truman Doctrine, Soviet expansion, and a world dividing into two camps. The Cold War is not fully born yet, but you feel its heartbeat beginning to quicken. Britain positions itself beside the United States, hoping proximity to power might keep its own shadow long. But there's no denying it. You feel the island's global role compressing like a shrinking balloon. You walk through an RAF station where planes stand grounded for lack of fuel, even as American aircraft hum across the sky in larger numbers. Pilots talk about the Berlin airlift, leaning against their planes as if they're leaning against an old friend they cannot afford to maintain. A mainstream fact flickers in your mind. During the airlift, American planes carry the vast majority of supplies into Berlin, while Britain contributes significantly but cannot match US capacity. Historians still argue whether Britain's reliance on the US was inevitable or avoidable. But standing here, you realize how little choice the country really had. The empire's economic arteries are clogged, and the costs of global policing are unsustainable. If Britain wants to stand firm against Soviet influence, it needs American muscle, and quickly. You drift into a parliamentary session where debates echo off cold stone walls. One MP insists Britain must still be a world power. Another counters that the nation should focus on rebuilding itself first. The tension is palpable. Pride wrestles with practicality. Identity clashes with economics. Someone mutters that Britain is becoming a Greece to America's Rome, and the chamber bristles, half offended, half worried it might be true. Yet, even amid this shift, Britain tries to hold on to symbols of influence. Diplomats still travel the world, wearing crisp suits and carrying briefcases full of polished arguments. The BBC broadcasts in dozens of languages, projecting culture even where it can no longer project might. And Britain's intelligence agencies, quiet, meticulous, slightly mysterious, still carry weight in the shadows. The country may not be the biggest force on the board anymore, but it still knows how to move pieces cleverly when needed. As you stroll through London's bustling streets, you hear conversations about NATO forming, about atomic weapons reshaping warfare, about alliances being drawn like chalk lines on a playground where two oversized children now dominate the game. The quirky tidbit of the hour comes from a cafe, where a man claims Britain should develop a mega T-bomb to keep up with nuclear powers. You silently applaud his creativity while questioning his understanding of physics. You turn a corner and find yourself staring up at the cenotaph, where fresh wreaths still rest from victory celebrations. And as you stand there, you feel the paradox of this moment. Britain has never been more triumphant, or more vulnerable. Its victory has exposed its limitations. Its strength has revealed its exhaustion. Its empire, once its shield and sword, is becoming an anchor. You exhale softly, understanding that Britain is now navigating unfamiliar territory, a world where it must negotiate, collaborate, and compromise rather than command. The Americans and Soviets loom on opposite horizons, and Britain walks the narrow ridge between them, hoping to remain relevant, respected, and stable. And with each step you take, you sense it more clearly. The age when Britain stood at the center of global power is ending, and a new world, one with louder voices and larger shadows, rises around it like a tide. You leave behind those corridors where power slips quietly from Britain's grasp, and you drift eastward in your mind, following the fading threads of empire toward the places where the illusion of British invincibility once stood brightest. You land first in the humid, tangled landscapes of Burma, where the air feels heavy enough to slow your breathing. Here, the rainforest once echoed with the tramp of British troops who believed themselves masters of the region, until the Japanese arrived and tore through that facade like damp paper. You walk along a muddy jungle path, feeling the thick canopy pressing close, and you realize how unprepared the British were for this terrain. A mainstream fact settles into your awareness. In early 1942, the Japanese swept through British-held Burma in one of the most rapid and devastating campaigns the empire ever suffered, forcing the British into a chaotic retreat that covered hundreds of miles. The empire that once seemed unshakable had been pushed backward by an enemy long dismissed as second-rate. Historians still argue whether it was British arrogance, insufficient preparation, or simple geographic disadvantage that doomed the defense of Burma. But you can feel that all three cling like vines around your ankles. You step into a ghostly airstrip where rusted metal and broken sandbags lie half swallowed by vegetation. Here, British prestige didn't just crack, it splintered. Troops who once carried themselves with the clipped confidence of imperial authority now trudged through monsoon rains with their boots squelching like overripe fruit, dodging enemy aircraft and leeches with equal dread. A soldier passing by mutters that the jungle is alive and rude about it, and you decide he's probably right. One quirky tidbit surfaces from the chaos. Some desperate troops supposedly smeared their socks with tobacco to keep leeches away, which is either ingenious or a war crime against your own feet. As you move deeper into Burma's shadows, you sense the psychological blow of defeat. People in Britain read newspapers full of words like setback and temporary withdrawal, but here on the ground, the truth was naked. Japan had humiliated the empire. Local populations saw that vulnerability. Colonial subjects noticed the once invincible British fleeing through their villages, begging for supplies and guidance. And once that spell of invincibility breaks, you don't easily put it back together. Then you shift northward and westward, letting your steps slide into the dense green hills of Malaya. The humidity hugs you like a damp blanket that nobody asked for. British officials arrive here after the war with the same polished manners and stiff upper lips they've always worn, but the memory of Japanese occupation lingers in the very soil. You hear whispers from the locals about how quickly the Japanese had pushed the British aside in 1941 to 42, and how many Malayans and Singaporeans realized during that occupation that Britain was not an unshakable guardian, but a fallible foreign ruler. As you wander through a rebuilt street in Singapore, you feel the quiet simmer of confidence among the people. Confidence that their destiny might not need to be chained to British rule anymore. This shift matters. It's not loud rebellion yet. It's a quiet, awakening thought. You hear it in the markets where stallkeepers talk about self-rule with a shrug, as naturally as discussing the weather. You feel it in the posture of young men who no longer look at British officers with deference, but with level, assessing eyes. A mainstream fact slips through your mind like a soft breeze. Japanese victories in Asia eroded British prestige far more severely than defeats in Europe. European subjects already knew Britain could be bruised. Asian subjects had never seen Britain beaten before, and they took note. Historians still argue whether it was Japan's military success or the British collapse in morale that mattered more, but you can feel that the psychological impact was immense. You glide into a colonial office where fans spin desperately overhead, pushing warm air in lazy circles. British administrators read reports of rising nationalist movements, some peaceful, some radicalizing after their wartime experiences. The Malay Nationalist Party, the anti-Japanese resistance fighters, returning veterans, all begin pushing for more autonomy. British officials murmur words like contain, manage, and gradual reform, but their voices tremble around the edges. You can tell they know they're patching leaks on a sinking ship. From there, you drift into a rubber plantation where workers tap trees with rhythmic skill. They talk openly now about labor rights, land ownership, independence, topics once suppressed, but now bubbling into everyday conversation. And that's when you hear your quirky tidbit of this section. Someone swears that during the Japanese occupation, an officer tried to mandate that everyone switch to chopsticks because it would increase rice efficiency. Whether true or folklore, the workers laugh about it, and even you can't decide if it's absurd or brilliant. Your steps pull you further into the post-war Malayan landscape, where Britain attempts to reassert control during the Malayan emergency, though the full crisis comes later. British officials try to portray themselves as returning heroes, restorers of order, but the people they rule are no longer impressed. The war has changed the calculus. Authority without power is just polite noise. You drift into a British garrison where soldiers play cards under the faint buzz of lanterns. One jokes that Britain's empire in Asia now feels like a three-legged stool missing two legs. You shake your head, amused and a little sad, because the joke isn't wrong. The men here know they're trying to hold together something that wants to come apart. You step into a small village where elders speak quietly under palm trees. They remember the British running, the Japanese arriving, the chaos of occupation. But most importantly, they remember a moment that shattered the myth that Britain was unreachable, immovable, untouchable. In their eyes, that memory is power. Colonialism is no longer destiny, it's an inconvenience. Historians still argue whether post-war British policies in Asia were doomed from the start, or whether more generous self-rule earlier might have changed the outcome. But as you stand amid the heat, the sweat, and the rising confidence of previously subjugated peoples, you sense the simple truth. Once the illusion of British superiority was gone, nothing Britain did could fully restore it. You wander through a port where ships unload supplies for reconstruction, while signs urge patience and loyalty. But the tide has shifted. The empire's authority is dissolving like sugar in hot tea, slowly at first. Then, all at once, Burma will push toward independence. Malaya will ignite into insurgency. Singapore will chart its own ambitious path. And Britain, weakened by war and humbled by defeat, can no longer pull the strings as it once did. As the sun dips low over the palm-lined horizon, you feel the same thought ripple through the region like a warm breeze. The empire wasn't invincible. It was never invincible. And the moment the people saw that, the unraveling couldn't be stopped. You drift from the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia into the vast, sun-bleached plains of the Indian subcontinent, where the air carries a different heaviness, one woven from centuries of rule, frustration, hope, and the growing sense that something monumental is about to break. When your feet touch the ground, the dust rises softly, warm against your skin, and you feel the pulse of a land that has outgrown the empire trying to contain it. India, in the mid-1940s, is not the India that Britain conquered. It is louder, more confident, more politically sophisticated. You walk through a bustling bazaar where merchants arrange piles of turmeric, chili, and coriander, bright, fragrant mountains of color, and you hear conversations in half a dozen languages: Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Tamil, Punjabi. Those voices no longer tremble with deference. They discuss the future boldly, casually, as if independence is no longer a question but an overdue appointment. A mainstream fact settles in your thoughts. By the end of World War II, India had the world's largest voluntary standing army. Over 2.5 million men served the British war effort. And those men are now returning home, trained, worldly, and far less willing to accept foreign rule. Historians still argue whether Britain ever had a realistic chance of holding India after 1945, or whether the war made independence inevitable. But as you walk through streets buzzing with political rallies, posters, and debates, you feel the inevitability like heat waves rising from pavement. The Raj is strained to its limits. Population pressures make governance unwieldy. Sectarian tensions simmer violently beneath the surface, and the administrative machinery, never designed for a democratic nation the size of a continent, grinds and sputters like an engine in its final miles. You wander into a Congress Party meeting held under a large banyan tree, where leaders speak with the practiced cadence of revolutionaries who know the world is listening. They talk of sovereignty, of unity, of a future defined by Indians rather than imperial decree. Children run nearby, playing cricket with a stick and a rubber ball, blissfully unaware that the destiny of millions is being debated under that shade. Then you shift toward a gathering of the Muslim League, where a different vision takes shape. A homeland for Muslims who fear marginalization in a Hindu-majority India. Voices are passionate but uneasy. The request for Pakistan is not born from triumph, but from fear, from a sense that community identity needs protection. You stand at the edge of the crowd, the tension humming in the air like a low wire. Everyone knows something must give. Your steps lead you to a railway station, where trains screech and whistle, packed with people, moving between cities, for work, for family, for politics. Here, in the swaying crowds and endless queues, you catch your quirky tidbit of the section. A wiry man claims Gandhi once encouraged his followers to spin so much khadi cloth that Britain would drown in homespun shirts. You picture a tidal wave of cotton shirts crashing into Westminster and can't help but smile at the image. As you board one of the trains, sitting between families carrying woven baskets and bundles wrapped in cloth, you sense how wide the cracks in the Raj have become. The war has drained Britain of money, patience, and administrative stamina. India, meanwhile, has grown in population, economic complexity, and political assertiveness. It is a mismatch now, an empire shrinking while the colony expands beyond its grasp. You travel north to Punjab, where fields of golden wheat ripple under the scorching sun. Farmers talk of food shortages, rising tensions, roving militias. You feel the air tighten with unease. Historians still argue whether partition was the result of political miscalculation, communal fear, or unavoidable pressure. But standing here, hearing the murmurs of distrust, you sense that unity is becoming fragile, stretched thin like a fraying rope. Then you glide toward Delhi, where British officials occupy bungalows with dwindling authority. Papers pile up on desks, telephones ring constantly, messengers hurry across verandas with updates from Bombay, Calcutta, Karachi. Inside the Viceroy's house, conversations tilt toward one conclusion: the British can no longer govern India effectively. Not with empty coffers, not with exhausted troops, not with political groups demanding the one thing imperialism cannot provide: equality. You catch a glimpse of Lord Wavell pacing in a hallway, muttering about impossible negotiations. Famine still haunts Bengal. Riots erupt unpredictably. Political leaders pull in different directions. Britain's grip loosens with every news report, every protest, every resigned sigh from an official who knows the tide has turned. Walking through the gardens, you overhear two civil servants whispering that India has become too large to rule and too dangerous to ignore. One jokes that trying to govern a subcontinent of 400 million people is like trying to ride an elephant that keeps deciding it doesn't like you. You chuckle quietly, even as you feel the truth vibrating beneath the humor. You move next into a neighborhood where posters of Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, and Ambedkar are plastered on walls. The people here no longer wait for permission to shape their future. They demand it. In their eyes, you see the unmistakable glow of a people who have realized their own power. Always the beginning of the end for any empire. A mainstream fact slides gently into your awareness. By 1946, the Royal Indian Navy mutinies, strikes erupt across major cities, and the British fear a full-scale uprising. Control is slipping, and they know it. Historians still argue whether these revolts hastened British withdrawal or simply revealed what leaders already understood. India could no longer be governed without massive military force that Britain did not have and could not afford. As the sun sets over the subcontinent in shimmering orange light, you sense the Raj trembling under its own weight. A nation of hundreds of millions, with millennia of history, is waking fully. Its demands grow louder by the day. The British presence, once imposing, now feels temporary, like scaffolding around a building that no longer belongs to them. You take a slow breath and feel the moment tightening like a drum. India is not just asking for independence. India is insisting, and Britain, overstretched and undermined, no longer has the strength to say no. You feel the air shift as you step from the restless streets of India into the quiet, vaulted halls of the Viceroy's house, soon to become the Rashtrapati Bhavan, but tonight still the last great stage of the Raj. The marble floors echo beneath your feet, the sound oddly hollow, as though even the building senses that its purpose is dissolving. Papers rustle, pens scratch, telephones ring, and everywhere you turn, people look like they're trying to stop a dam from bursting, with nothing but a stack of memos and a worried expression. And then you see him, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the final Viceroy of India, moving through the corridors with a speed that feels almost frantic. His uniform is immaculate, his posture crisp, his charisma unmistakable. But you sense the anxiety just beneath the surface. Mountbatten is here to negotiate the end of British rule. But what he has walked into is not a gentle transition. It's a storm, political, communal, logistical, and the clock is ticking far faster than he expected. A mainstream fact settles over you like a warm cloth. Mountbatten shaved years off the original timetable for British withdrawal, accelerating the handover to meet a hard deadline, August 1947. Historians still argue whether he rushed the process irresponsibly or simply recognized that the British no longer had the capacity to govern a subcontinent unraveling at the seams. But as you follow him through endless meetings, you can feel the pressure tightening around his decisions like a vice. He meets Gandhi first, sitting cross-legged on the floor, radiating a calm so profound it almost makes you forget the riots erupting across the country. Gandhi speaks softly, urging unity, pleading for peace, insisting that partition is a tragedy, not a solution. You feel his voice ripple through the room like wind through tall grass, and yet you know, deep down, that his dream of a united India is slipping away. Then you move with Mountbatten into a high-ceilinged chamber where Jinnah awaits. The founder of the Muslim League, frail yet fierce, sits with an intensity that seems to sharpen the very air. He demands Pakistan, not out of arrogance, but out of fear that Muslims would be politically swallowed in a Hindu-majority nation. The two men talk past each other at times, circling the inevitability neither truly wants but both understand. At one point, Mountbatten jokes lightly to ease the tension, and Jinnah does not laugh. You wince on Mountbatten's behalf. Some jokes are simply not meant for history. Your quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a rumor whispered among staff that Mountbatten once said he felt like a man trying to keep two giant elephants from charging while riding neither. Whether he truly said it or not, the image fits perfectly. You imagine him gripping imaginary reins, dragged along by forces far larger than any colonial administrator could control. Next, you sit in on a tense meeting with Nehru, whose eloquence fills the room like fire and music intertwined. Nehru wants independence, fast, but he fears the wounds that partition will carve across the subcontinent. As he and Mountbatten study the maps spread across the table, their faces grow taut. Somewhere in the room, a clock ticks with maddening insistence. Historians still argue whether Mountbatten's decisions worsened the violence that followed, or whether any other timetable would have been even bloodier. But as riots intensify, and trains full of dead and fleeing families begin to appear, you feel the crushing truth. No path forward is free of tragedy. The question is no longer whether partition will happen, but how much it will hurt. You drift into the room where Cyril Radcliffe works by lamplight, tasked with drawing the border between India and Pakistan, despite having never visited India before. He sweats over maps that blur into abstractions, their lines representing millions of lives, their curves holding the seeds of both nations and nightmares. You want to place a hand on his shoulder, to tell him no one should ever have this responsibility. Instead, he sits alone, pen trembling slightly as the deadline looms. You step outside into the heavy Delhi heat, where crowds gather with a strange mix of celebration and dread. Some wave flags, some chant slogans, some watch with haunted eyes as violence spirals in Punjab and Bengal. You hear fear in the streets, rumbling like distant thunder. Partition has not yet arrived, but its shadow already stretches across the land. Inside government offices, Mountbatten is everywhere, meeting, negotiating, soothing, pushing. His staff rush to keep up. Documents fly across tables. Decisions are made that will ripple across generations. And every time you catch Mountbatten's eye, even in passing, you see a man racing to keep history from outrunning him. You glide through the Viceroy's garden near midnight, where Mountbatten walks alone under a canopy of stars, deep in thought. Maybe he wonders whether he is doing enough. Maybe he wonders whether he is doing too much. Maybe he simply wonders how anyone could possibly steer a nation of 400 million people through such a narrow doorway without disaster. And then comes the day, 15th August, 1947. You stand beside Mountbatten in the sweltering heat as the Indian flag rises above the newly independent nation. Crowds roar. Fireworks burst. For a moment, it seems like joy conquers all. But as the celebrations swell, you feel the weight of everything happening outside this moment. Caravans of refugees, burning villages, terrified families fleeing across an invisible line drawn on a map. Britain is leaving. India is born, Pakistan is born, and the world is forever altered. Historians still argue whether Mountbatten was a hero, a hurried executor, or simply a man trapped in an impossible storm. But as you watch him step away from the podium, his spine straight, but his eyes heavy, you understand one simple truth. He did not control history. History swept him along, just as it swept away the Raj. You leave the heat of Delhi behind and drift westward, carried on a warm desert wind toward a different kind of British unraveling. One made not of geography and borders, but of promises layered so thickly they eventually crushed the hands that tried to hold them. When your feet touch the ground again, you find yourself standing in the tense, sun-bleached streets of Mandate, Palestine, where the midday light feels harsh enough to carve shadows into the stone. The first thing you notice is contradiction. Everywhere, in every direction. A British soldier leans against a sandbagged checkpoint with a weary slump, sweat dripping from his helmet, while a group of young Jewish immigrants pass by, their faces tense, their futures uncertain. Across the street, Arab shopkeepers close their shutters early, murmuring about yet another night of unrest. It's a land strained by competing dreams, and the British stand awkwardly in the middle, like someone who promised to referee a game without knowing the rules. A mainstream fact settles quietly into your thoughts. Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, supporting a national home for the Jewish people, while also promising to protect the rights of the Arab inhabitants, a diplomatic balancing act so delicate that it was practically designed to collapse. Historians still argue whether this contradiction was naive goodwill, strategic wartime maneuvering, or cynical imperial calculus. But as you walk through Jerusalem's narrow alleys, you feel the consequences pressing against your skin like crowded walls. You pass a bulletin board plastered with notices, ration updates, curfews, missing persons. Next to them hangs a tattered poster of the British crown, curled at the edges like it's trying to escape its own paper surface. A soldier nearby mutters that Mandate Palestine feels like trying to hold water in a fishing net. His comrade adds that the fishing net is on fire. You give them both silent points for creativity. Your steps guide you into a smoky cafe in Jaffa, where British officials sit hunched over chipped teacups, discussing reports from across the region. Jewish paramilitary groups, Haganah, Irgun, Lehi, are growing bolder. Arab rebel cells operate in the hills. British patrols are attacked with increasing frequency. The men talk in low voices, half exhausted, half afraid, all painfully aware that their mandate is slipping through their fingers like sand. You notice a quirky tidbit among the conversation. One officer claims that British soldiers started referring to their armored cars as pregnant turtles because they were slow, awkward, and hopelessly vulnerable to roadside bombs. You can't help imagining a turtle waddling through a war zone and thinking, yes, that's about right. Outside, you pass a Jewish refugee ship anchored under heavy guard. Families crowd the deck, clutching bundles and memories, hoping for entry to the land they believe will save them. Many of them are survivors of the Holocaust, and the desperation in their eyes hits you like a sudden gust of cold wind. Britain, still rebuilding from its own wartime trauma, struggles to manage the influx. American pressure looms overhead. President Truman demands Britain open the gates to Jewish refugees, and the British government wavers, trapped between humanitarian urgency and the fear of igniting an already volatile region. Historians still argue whether Britain could have crafted a better immigration policy, one that might have eased tensions. But as you stand on the dock watching soldiers pace nervously, you doubt any policy could have cured wounds this deep or met hopes this high. Your path leads you into an Arab neighborhood where elders sit beneath olive trees, their voices laced with bitterness. They speak of broken promises, of land lost, of fear that their homes will soon fall within someone else's country. Their words tangle with smoke from a nearby bakery and drift over rooftops like restless ghosts. Then, an explosion. Distant, but close enough to make your heart jump. The British soldiers immediately tense, their routines smooth from grim practice. The Irgun has bombed another administrative building. Someone mutters that every week the walls of the Mandate grow a little thinner, as if the region is peeling the British out like a splinter. You wander next to the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, its stone walls shimmering under the sun. Here, in 1946, a bomb planted by Irgun fighters killed dozens, including British officials. You feel the weight of that memory lingering in the stones. A mainstream fact pulses in your mind. This attack marked a turning point, convincing many British leaders that their position was untenable. The cost, financially, politically, emotionally, was stretching beyond reason. Historians still argue whether Britain mishandled intelligence that day or whether they were simply overwhelmed. But the result is etched in history. Confidence evaporated. Authority cracked. The mandate started its downward spiral. Now you follow a convoy of British trucks rattling down a dirt road, dust swirling behind them like a veil. Soldiers scan rooftops, windows, alleyways. Everywhere danger might lurk. These are no longer imperial patrols. These are men trapped in a conflict not their own, trying to enforce rules no one respects in a land where everyone is fighting for a future they believe is rightfully theirs. At a military headquarters, officers hunch over route maps covered with pins and grease pencil markings. The room smells of sweat, ink, and nerves. Someone suggests bringing in reinforcements. Someone else laughs bitterly and asks, with what money? The Empire's purse is empty, and its patience even emptier. You slip out into the golden dusk as muezzins call the evening prayer from minarets while synagogues begin to fill for worship. The melodies overlap, entwining in an eerie, beautiful harmony that lasts only a moment before evaporating back into tension. As the sun sinks below the horizon, you feel the inevitable conclusion tightening like a slow-drawn curtain. Britain cannot keep the mandate. It cannot satisfy both Arabs and Jews. It cannot pay for endless policing. It cannot hold a land that rejects its presence from all directions. And so, on the 15th of May, 1948, Britain leaves. The Union Jack slips down its pole for the last time. The British soldiers march out. The streets erupt, not into peace, but into open war. The State of Israel is declared. Arab armies mobilize. The region ignites. Historians still argue whether Britain's departure caused the ensuing conflict or simply allowed it to erupt. But as you watch the final British ship pull away from the port, its stern disappearing into the Mediterranean haze, you understand this was not an exit. This was a collapse, a sign to the world that the Empire's pillars were cracking. One more piece falling away from a structure too brittle to stand much longer. You leave the charged streets of Palestine behind and drift upward into a quieter, weightier space, the psychological terrain of an empire that has finally begun to understand what the rest of the world has sensed for years. You hover above a Britain that still outwardly calls itself great, yet inwardly feels something far less triumphant. And as you settle back onto London's damp pavements, you realize that the greatest blows to the empire are no longer military or economic. They're emotional, symbolic, spiritual, in a way that empires rarely prepare for. The Union Jack still flutters on government buildings, but you sense the fabric sagging, as though the wind itself is tired of carrying it. A mainstream fact whispers into your ear. Between 1947 and 1948, Britain lost control of its two most significant and globally symbolic possessions, India and Palestine. Historians still argue whether these losses marked the true beginning of the end or were simply the most dramatic episodes in a decline already set in motion. But as you stand in the drizzle outside Westminster, you can feel that these events didn't just change borders. They changed Britain's view of itself. Inside Parliament, voices rise in frustrated debates. Some MPs blame poor leadership. Others blame nationalist movements. Others blame America. And a few whisper, usually off the record, that perhaps the empire was always more fragile than they liked to admit. When you listen closely, you notice something missing: confidence. The empire used to speak with the booming assurance of someone who believed history was on their side. Now the tone is thinned into something like uncertainty, wrapped in nostalgia. Walking down Whitehall, you overhear a joke among civil servants. your quirky tidbit for this section. Someone mutters that the colonial office should swap its paperwork for fishing rods because we've let more territory slip through our fingers this year than cod in the North Atlantic. The others laugh, a little too loudly, as though trying to drown out the truth beneath the humor. You drift into the Imperial Institute, where exhibits once celebrated the empire's vastness, with maps painted confidently in British red. Now those same maps look like aging promises. You watch visitors move slowly past display cases, their expressions shifting, not pride, but confusion. What does it mean for a nation raised on the myth of eternal empire to wake up and find that myth unraveling? Historians still argue whether British identity was genuinely intertwined with imperial rule, or whether nostalgia later exaggerated that connection. But as you watch a school teacher explain to students why India is no longer ours, you see the difficulty on her face. Britain is not just losing territory, it's losing a story it told itself for centuries. You step into a smoky London pub where old veterans nurse pints of bitter and talk about the war. They won it, they remind each other. They defeated the Axis. They helped liberate Europe. They kept the island free. But somewhere in the pauses between their words, you hear another truth. The victory gave them pride, but it also exhausted the empire's last reserves. One man sighs and says, "Funny, isn't it? The war finished off the empire we fought to protect." No one disagrees. Stepping back outside, you feel the weight of perception shifting across the globe. News from India, Pakistan, Palestine travels quickly. Editorials in Cairo celebrate the retreat of British authority. Newspapers in Nairobi whisper that colonial masters can be challenged. Politicians in Singapore study each crisis carefully, learning which pressure points make the empire flinch. Britain's withdrawals, once seen as the natural rhythms of benevolent governance, now look more like involuntary concessions. You drift into the colonial office itself, where officials shuffle between rooms with stacks of reports detailing strikes, protests, demands for suffrage, calls for self-rule. The memos pile high like sandbags against an incoming tide. Someone whispers that if Britain couldn't control India, the jewel in the crown, how could it possibly control smaller colonies with rising nationalist movements and growing populations? The unspoken answer hangs heavily in the air. It can't. You follow the trail of documents into a room where analysts track disturbances across the empire. Nigeria, Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus. Red pins mark trouble spots, clustered so tightly they make the world map look like it has measles. You taste the anxiety in the room, metallic and sharp. Historians still argue whether Britain could have reformed its empire into a voluntary federation or commonwealth earlier, thereby easing the psychological blow. But the mood you feel here tells you otherwise. The empire was built on hierarchy, not partnership. Equality was never part of the blueprint. So when the foundations cracked, they did so loudly, violently. You wander next into a home where a family gathers around a radio listening to news of India's partition. The mother shakes her head at the reports of violence. The father mutters something about losing the heart of the empire. Their children sit quietly, absorbing the tremble in their parents' voices. Nations don't always recognize historical turning points when they happen, but this household does. You can see it in their eyes. You stroll through a university courtyard where students debate imperialism with fiery clarity. Some argue that decolonization is moral progress. Others insist Britain is surrendering its rightful place in the world. The arguments echo off stone arches, swirling like birds above your head. Philosophers, historians, economists, they all sense that Britain must redefine itself, but no one can agree how. Walking through St. James's Park, you notice a man feeding ducks while reading a newspaper headlined with "Unrest in Yet Another Colony." He sighs deeply, as though every distant riot adds a pound of weight to his shoulders. It's all slipping away," he says quietly. Not to you, but to the ducks, who seem sympathetic. You continue through the city, feeling the shift in the national psyche. Britain is not collapsing, it is shrinking. And shrinking, after centuries of expansion, feels like failure, even if it's necessary. The psychological blow goes beyond loss. It creates a vacuum in which Britain must confront questions it has avoided for generations. Who are we without an empire? What defines our greatness now? What future can we build that doesn't lean on the past? As the evening fog rolls across the Thames, you sense something else, something gentler beneath the bruised pride, a humility growing in the cracks, a realization that influence can take forms other than domination, a quiet hope that identity can be rebuilt. But for now, the wound is raw, the pride unsettled, the empire undeniably fading. The world sees it, and for the first time, Britain sees it too. You move away from the fog-draped bridges of London and feel the world widening again beneath your feet, stretching south and east into territories where the empire's red lines once sprawled confidently across maps. But now those lines look faded, trembling at the edges. The empire isn't just losing prestige, it's losing control on the ground. And as you drift into the humid air of Southeast Asia once more, you realize you're entering a pattern, a rhythm of uprisings, counterinsurgencies, promises, delays, and the slow, grinding fatigue of a superstructure trying to hold itself together while the world pulls at every seam. Your first stop is Burma, where energy crackles through the streets, not as violent chaos, but as political momentum. Britain's authority feels like a thin film stretched over a pot at full boil. The anti-fascist People's Freedom League demands autonomy. Students wave banners, monks march, farmers whisper about self-determination. And Britain, drained by war and humiliated by Japan's wartime victories, can no longer enforce obedience with the old imperial swagger. A mainstream fact touches your shoulder. Burma gains independence in 1948, earlier and more abruptly than British planners ever expected. Historians still argue whether this swift exit was wise or reckless, whether Burma would have benefited from a slower transfer of power, or whether any delay would have ignited deeper conflict. But you sense urgency here. Britain simply doesn't have the strength to linger. You walk past a British administrator sweating through his khaki uniform as he packs up an office that smells faintly of mildew and paper. He mutters that the Burmese didn't even wait for us to finish the paperwork. You glance at the towering stack of unsorted files and think he might be right. Then he adds, your quirky tidbit of the hour, that his typewriter jammed so often during the final weeks that he suspects the machine was trying to decolonize itself. You step back outside, where children play barefoot in dusty streets already carrying new flags, new slogans, new visions. Burma is no longer waiting for permission. Next, you drift across the water toward Malaya, where the air shifts from hopeful to tense, thick with a metallic scent of impending conflict. Here, the British face a very different kind of challenge. Not a political negotiation, but a guerrilla war. The Malayan emergency erupts in 1948, and suddenly British troops find themselves fighting communist insurgents in dense jungles they barely understand. You walk alongside a patrol hacking through undergrowth that slaps against their uniforms. The humidity is a living creature, smothering your breath. A young British soldier jokes that the leeches have unionized and now demand fair treatment and frequent snacking rights. You chuckle, though you keep your socks tucked tightly, just in case. A mainstream fact flickers into your mind. The Malayan emergency lasts 12 long years, consuming money, manpower, and political patience Britain can scarcely spare. Historians still argue whether it was a military victory, a political one, or simply an unsustainable holding action. But standing here, the jungle buzzing around you with insects and tension, you sense that even the victories feel temporary. You pass a village where British officials speak with local chiefs under the shade of a broad banana leaf canopy. Their tone is stern but anxious, thinly coated with authority. They talk about development, cooperation, loyalty, and the chiefs nod politely, though you can't tell if they agree or are simply waiting for the British to leave. You hear children humming improvised songs about freedom, their voices soft but unmistakable. Then you move west, slipping into the savannas of Africa, where heat radiates in slow waves off packed earth. In the Gold Coast, later Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah rallies massive crowds who cheer with thunderous conviction. Accra's streets vibrate with chants for independence. Britain watches nervously but understands the momentum is unstoppable. A mainstream fact anchors itself in your thoughts. The Gold Coast becomes Ghana in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence, and its success becomes a spark across the continent. Historians still argue whether Ghana's peaceful transition accelerated decolonization across Africa, or whether African nationalism had already reached critical mass. But you see clearly how confidence spreads faster than any army. You drift through Lagos, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, where the winds of nationalism blow against British authority like an oncoming storm. Workers strike. Students organize. Newspapers publish fiery editorials. Britain responds, sometimes with negotiation, sometimes with repression, but always with a sense of being 2 steps behind. In Kenya, tension hardens into the Mau Mau uprising. You wander through the highlands where Kikuyu fighters move like shadows. British settlers clutch their rifles and peer nervously into forests. The colonial government constructs detention camps, curfews, fences of barbed wire. A mainstream fact surfaces like a warning bell. By the mid-1950s, the conflict escalates brutally on both sides, costing thousands of lives and fracturing any illusion that British rule is benevolent here. Historians still argue whether the Mau Mau were freedom fighters, terrorists, or something far more complex, a symptom of decades of land alienation and racial hierarchy. But as you walk past a British officer wiping sweat from his brow and muttering about a rebellion we should have seen coming, you realize complexity doesn't erase inevitability. Your quirky tidbit arises from a settler couple who claim goats in their region learned to recognize British patrols by the sound of their boots and responded by bleating angrily every time they approached. Whether fact or legend, the goats sound like they're picking a side. In every direction, you see the same pattern: demands for independence intertwined with rising confidence. The empire looks increasingly like a stretched wire trembling under too much tension. Any spark might snap it. By the time you drift back into the cool corridors of the Colonial Office in London, you can almost predict the rhythm of each report. Another strike here, another uprising there, another nationalist movement gaining momentum. Ministers read the updates with weary eyes. Some advocate reform. Others advocate force. Most simply acknowledge that the old imperial formula no longer works. The empire is being challenged not at one point, but everywhere, all at once. And Britain, financially drained and politically vulnerable, doesn't have the strength to tighten every bolt. The wave of independence movements is growing. Not coordinated, not identical, but united by one truth. Colonial subjects have seen the empire bleed. They know it can be beaten, and they believe deeply, fiercely, passionately that their time has come. You drift from the broad sweep of uprisings across Asia and Africa and step into territories where the terrain of empire feels different, harder, heavier, gripped by the hands of people who do not see themselves as subjects, but as settlers, owners, heirs. These are the settler colonies, the places where British identity took root far from the island. where European communities grew large and influential enough that independence movements provoked fear, not compromise. And as your feet touch the dry earth of Kenya's highlands, you feel immediately why Britain clung more tightly here. Because settlers believed they had built something permanent, and because the empire, already teetering, found it emotionally impossible to walk away without a fight. You wander past a whitewashed farmhouse where the veranda creaks under the weight of wicker chairs and overheard anxieties. A settler woman stirs her tea and complains that Britain is losing its backbone, while a man pacing nearby mutters that the empire must stand firm, as though determination alone could turn back a rising tide of independence. A mainstream fact settles in your mind. In regions with large European settler populations, Kenya, southern Rhodesia, Algeria under the French, colonial powers almost always responded to nationalist demands with harsher repression. Historians still argue whether this was ideological rigidity, racial panic, or simple political pressure from settlers who feared losing land and status. But as you watch the tension twist through every conversation around you, you sense it was all three. You drift across fields where Kikuyu farmers once worked land now occupied by settler estates. The resentment hangs in the air like dust. When the Mau Mau uprising intensifies in the early 1950s, the British respond with mass detentions, curfews, forced relocations, and sweeping emergency powers. You walk through a camp surrounded by barbed wire, where rows of detainees sit in the heat, watched by guards who look as weary as they are determined. A British officer wipes sweat from his brow and admits quietly that this isn't policing, this is something darker. You feel the heaviness of that truth settle on your shoulders. Then, your quirky tidbit emerges from the edge of a settler market, where a wiry old man swears that the local ostriches have learned to avoid British patrols because they know the soldiers always walk in straight lines, and ostriches zigzag. You're not entirely sure whether to believe him, but the mental image of a zigzagging ostrich outsmarting colonial authority feels strangely poetic. You drift next to southern Rhodesia, where white settlers are even more entrenched, confident, and resistant to any political change. Here, the British government finds itself negotiating not just with nationalists, but with its own transplanted citizens. Citizens who believe that empire exists to protect their privileges. You walk past parliament buildings in Salisbury, where officials debate constitutional reforms, their voices sharp with fear of majority rule. Outside, African activists gather in growing numbers, their chants echoing across the city like an oncoming storm. A mainstream fact slips into your awareness. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, the British attempted to implement gradual reforms across settler territories. But in places like Rhodesia, such reforms were blocked or watered down by settler pressure. Historians still argue whether Britain truly intended to grant equal rights, or whether it hoped to maintain a hierarchical system as long as possible. But you see the problem clearly. Settler colonies were built on inequality as their foundation. Removing it was never going to be peaceful. You follow the tension southward into South Africa, no longer part of the empire, but still deeply connected to its legacy. Apartheid tightens its grip, and the British can do little but watch from afar as a nation forged in imperialism sinks into systemic racism on a scale that shocks even hardened colonial administrators. Britain's moral authority evaporates further, criticized for its silence and its complicity. Then you shift westward into Cyprus, where Greek Cypriots demand enosis, union with Greece, while Turkish Cypriots fear marginalization. You walk through narrow streets where chalk slogans cover walls, where British soldiers patrol nervously past shops shuttered against bomb threats. The Ioka insurgency erupts, and the British respond with detention camps, interrogations, and severe counterinsurgency tactics. You hear a soldier joke, your next quirky tidbit. that Cyprus should come with a user manual labeled "Warning, contains political complexity beyond your clearance level." But beneath the humor, you sense exhaustion. Everywhere the empire turns, it finds not obedience, but resistance. You return to Kenya briefly, following the arc of violence rising and falling like a fever. In the countryside, British forces declare protected villages, moving entire communities into fenced compounds to isolate the Mau Mau fighters. The landscape changes. Roads hardened, forests cut back, watchtowers erected. It's administration at gunpoint, something the British insist is necessary, though the word feels more like a shield than an explanation. Historians still argue whether these tactics saved lives or destroyed a generation. But when you walk past the barbed wire, hearing the voices of detainees singing sad, rhythmic songs under the evening sky, you feel the profound cost etched into every note. You drift next to Aden in southwest Arabia, a port colony that becomes another flashpoint. British armored trucks rumble through dusty streets where insurgents emerge from alleys, vanish into crowds, reappear on rooftops. Independence demands fuel, explosions, assassinations, ambushes. You overhear a British corporal mutter that Aden feels like fighting ghosts in an oven, and you understand why. Britain is not facing armies, but ideas. Ideas that move invisibly from town to town, generation to generation. A mainstream fact anchors you again. By the early 1960s, over 40 insurgencies or nationalist movements challenge British rule across the globe. That number alone tells the story. An empire stretched so thin that every confrontation feels like a final exam Britain didn't study for. Yet the empire clings hardest where settlers refuse to relinquish their world. In these places, Kenya, Rhodesia, Cyprus, Aden, British responses turn more coercive, more desperate, more revealing of the empire's contradictions. Britain claims it wants to guide colonies toward democracy, yet often suppresses democratic movements when they threaten settler dominance or Cold War strategy. You wander into a quiet London office where officials pore over reports, trying to find a balance between moral responsibility, financial strain, and political rivalry. The mood is bleak. If Britain loosens its grip, settlers panic. If it tightens its grip, nationalists rebel. If it withdraws, chaos erupts. If it stays, chaos deepens. Historians still argue whether Britain's real mistake was trying to maintain control at all, whether a cleaner, earlier exit might have spared bloodshed. But as you walk through this exhausted empire, you sense that Britain no longer controls even its own choices. Circumstances control them now. And through it all, one truth echoes around you like a drumbeat. Where settlers were few, Britain negotiated. Where settlers were many, Britain fought. And where Britain fought, the empire bled the most. You drift from the dust and tension of settler colonies back toward Britain's political core, where another storm is brewing. One not in the jungles of Malaya or the highlands of Kenya, but in the polished conference rooms and smoky war cabinets of London itself. The year is 1956, and you feel the city's heartbeat quicken as rumors ripple through corridors. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser has nationalized the Suez Canal Company. That single act sends a shockwave through the empire's spine, and Britain reacts as though someone has yanked away the last major symbol of its global authority. When your feet touch the ground again, you're standing outside number 10 Downing Street, where Prime Minister Anthony Eden paces beneath flickering lamplight. His jaw is set, his movements sharp with anger. To him, and to many in Britain, Nasser's move feels like a direct insult, a slap across the face of a former superpower trying to maintain its dignity. The empire may be fading, but the canal still represents control, commerce, and a lingering claim to global relevance. A mainstream fact settles firmly into your mind. The Suez Canal carried about 2/3 of Europe's oil and was one of the most strategically vital waterways in the world. Losing influence there felt like losing oxygen. Historians still argue whether Eden acted to protect British interests or to preserve British pride. But as you slip into a late-night cabinet meeting, you sense pride outweighs strategy by several uncomfortable pounds. The room buzzes with tension. Maps spread across tables. Advisors argue. Eden insists on decisive action. To him, humiliation is not an option. And then, whispered agreements, secret handshakes. The plan materializes. Britain, France, and Israel form a clandestine pact. Israel will invade Sinai, giving Britain and France the justification to intervene as peacekeepers, retake the Canal Zone, and topple Nasser's growing influence. It's a strategy that feels as calculated as it is desperate, like trying to bluff with a losing hand because folding isn't emotionally tolerable. Your quirky tidbit arrives courtesy of a harried junior official who mutters that the secret meeting felt less like grand strategy and more like three angry uncles planning to take back a stolen lawnmower. You can't help smirking, because despite the stakes, the whole plan carries an edge of theatrical bravado. You drift next to Cairo, where Nasser's voice booms through loudspeakers, deep and confident, electrifying crowds. He is not intimidated. If anything, he seems invigorated. Egyptians chant his name in the streets, celebrating the nationalization of the canal as an act of defiance against imperialism. To them, Nasser is a symbol of modern Arab nationalism, the future rising to challenge the old world. Days later, you follow Israeli tanks rolling into Sinai, sand spraying from their treads. British and French warplanes prepare to strike. The empire, battered and shrinking, tries to muster one last display of might. But as you move between command rooms and corridors of power, you feel something off, a tension that doesn't belong to fear of Egypt, but fear of something far larger. And then it hits you like a bucket of cold water. The United States and the Soviet Union are not amused. A mainstream fact pulses sharply through your mind. Both superpowers, despite their rivalry, demand Britain stop. The US, under President Eisenhower, fears destabilizing the Middle East and resents not being consulted. The USSR threatens intervention and even nuclear retaliation. Historians still argue whether Eisenhower's motives were geopolitical or personal disdain for colonial ambition, but the effect is the same. The superpowers flex, and Britain feels the shockwave. You stand in a telegraph room as cables arrive from Washington, each one more forceful than the last. One American message reads like a diplomatic slap. Another British official mutters, "We're being scolded like schoolboys." The joke lands flat. The markets panic. The pound plummets. Britain's financial stability teeters within days, and the US refuses to support the currency until Britain withdraws from Egypt. You feel the humiliation tightening like a vice across the faces of ministers. The empire hasn't just taken a hit, it has been publicly overruled. You drift into the House of Commons, where opposition MPs roar, emboldened by the unfolding disaster. Eden's government denies defeat, even as everyone senses it. The pressure mounts. International condemnation grows louder, and then, slowly, painfully, inevitably, Britain halts its military operation. Historians still argue whether Eden miscalculated global politics or simply clung to an outdated vision of British power. But as you watch him collapse into a chair, shoulders slumped, you see a man forced to confront a truth he'd fought desperately to ignore. The Suez Crisis becomes the moment when the world sees Britain not as a superpower or even a near superpower, but as a middle-ranking nation unable to act without permission from Washington. Back in Egypt, Nasser strides through cheering crowds, victorious, defiant, a symbol of post-colonial triumph. In London, newspapers print phrases like national humiliation and a turning point. In Africa and Asia, nationalist leaders celebrate the blow to imperial arrogance. Britain's aura of authority evaporates almost overnight. You wander into a smoky London pub where men huddle around radios, listening to updates that sound less like news and more like eulogies for imperial confidence. Someone mutters that Britain has lost the ability to act on its own, and no one contradicts him. Your quirky tidbit comes from a bartender who jokes that if the Empire had a bucket list, losing an argument with its own ally probably wasn't on it. Outside, fog clings to the Thames, as if trying to hide the nation's embarrassment. You feel the shift in the air, heavy, undeniable. The Suez Crisis didn't just expose Britain's weakness. It forced Britain to accept its weakness. A mainstream fact settles like a stone. After Suez, Britain accelerates decolonization and never again attempts independent, large-scale military action without American approval. Historians still argue whether the crisis hastened the end of empire or merely revealed it. But as you watch Parliament's lights dim and hear the city's uneasy quiet, you understand the deeper reality. Suez wasn't the end of the British Empire. It was the moment everyone finally admitted it. And the world, Britain included, would never look at the empire the same way again. You drift away from the humiliation lingering over Westminster after Suez, and suddenly, Britain's world begins to tilt. Gently at first, then with the unmistakable slide of something that has lost its center of gravity. The late 1950s bleed into the 1960s, and you can feel the pace of decolonization accelerating like a train that has finally realized its brakes don't work. What was once resisted tooth and nail becomes policy. What was once denied becomes accepted. And what once defined Britain's global identity becomes a burden too heavy for a weary nation to carry. You step into the colonial office again, but the atmosphere has changed. Gone are the anxious debates about holding on. In their place come tired discussions about letting go. Ministers sit around a long wooden table with cups of cooling tea, murmuring phrases like orderly transition, self-government, and managed withdrawal. The words sound almost peaceful until you realize they're describing the dismantling of an empire built over centuries. A mainstream fact settles over you. Between 1957 and 1968, Britain grants independence to more than 20 African nations: Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, Botswana, and more. It's one of the fastest decolonization waves in recorded history. Historians still argue whether this pace was strategic wisdom, financial necessity, or political panic triggered by Suez. But whatever the cause, you feel the inevitability gathering like a strong tide. Your feet touch down first in Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah stands on a stage beneath strings of lights, raising a hand before a sea of cheering supporters. The night air vibrates with music, hope, and the scent of rain on warm earth. When the British flag comes down for the last time, the crowd erupts, not with anger, but with pride. And you sense something shifting. Independence is no longer a distant dream. It's real, achievable, contagious. You drift eastward into Nigeria, where the Union Jack lowers again amid careful choreography and cautious optimism. British civil servants shake hands with incoming Nigerian leaders, smiling for the cameras while quietly calculating how many more transitions await them next year and the year after that. In the markets of Lagos, women sell bright fabrics and roasted plantains, chatting about the future with a lightness you didn't hear a decade earlier. Children run around chanting slogans. A man leans toward you and says, "The British taught us how to organize. That makes it easier to show them our way out." You laugh gently, not because it's funny, but because it's so disarmingly accurate. Your quirky tidbit emerges from a small Ghanaian cafe, where someone insists the British left behind more forgotten umbrellas and mismatched teacups than functioning administrative records. "These people," he says, waving a teaspoon, "carry their weather with them." You imagine an empire collapsing under the weight of accidentally abandoned umbrellas, and for a moment, the world feels softer. Then you shift into East Africa, where independence comes in waves, but not always gently. In Tanganyika and Zanzibar, soon to be Tanzania, celebrations brim with joy. In Kenya, the handover follows years of conflict, trauma, and deep distrust. You stand in Nairobi watching Jomo Kenyatta sworn in as Prime Minister, the crowd tense with hope and pain interwoven, like a fabric woven from barbed wire and silk. A mainstream fact resurfaces. Many British policymakers come to believe that independence is cheaper than repression. Maintaining garrisons, policing unrest, and funding colonial administrations costs far more than allowing self-rule. Historians still argue whether Britain's economic logic masked moral responsibility, or whether it was simply the only viable path left. But either way, you feel the shift. Decolonization is now fiscal policy as much as ideology. You drift south into Botswana, then Bechuanaland, where the transition unfolds quietly and smoothly, the land wide and open under a vast sky. Here, British officials work politely with local leaders, shaking hands as though signing rental agreements rather than ending colonial rule. The pace is calm, the mood respectful, almost gentle. You breathe easier for a moment. But when you move deeper into the 1960s, the air darkens again. You watch as Rhodesia declares unilateral independence, not to embrace majority rule, but to resist it. White settlers attempt to seize the future from Britain's hands, clinging to a colonial identity even as the empire itself crumbles beneath them. Britain responds with sanctions rather than force, a sign of its depleted power. A British diplomat sighs and tells you, "We're negotiating with ghosts of our own making." And he's right. The empire is now mostly ghosts. Ghosts of decisions made decades earlier. Ghosts of ambitions stretched too far. Ghosts of an identity Britain built around the idea that it would always matter more than the rest. You float next to the Caribbean, where independence unfolds with calypso rhythms, speeches under palm trees, and a different flavor of transition. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados. They all step forward, their leaders crisp in suits that shine under Caribbean sun. Britain sends delegations wearing linen suits and diplomatic smiles, trying not to melt in the heat. Your quirky tidbit comes from a Jamaican shopkeeper who claims the only British custom he'll miss is complaining about the weather, because ours is too perfect. Back in London, you wander into cabinet offices where young politicians now speak a different language. Not of empire, but of Commonwealth cooperation, trade blocs, and European integration. The future is tilting toward Brussels, not Bombay. A mainstream fact quietly hums beneath the political chatter. The cost of empire, military bases, administrative staffs, infrastructure, subsidies, exceeds Britain's capacity to pay after the war. The empire is no longer a source of wealth. It's a financial sinkhole. And with American pressure nudging Britain toward the Western Alliance, the days of solitary imperial rule are over. Historians still argue whether the late 50s and 60s decolonization wave happened too quickly or not quickly enough. But from where you stand, floating between ex-colonies celebrating at dawn and British offices lit by the worried glow of late-night paperwork, you sense the deeper truth. Britain did not choose to end its empire. Circumstances ended it for Britain. The Suez Crisis shattered illusions. Nationalist movements shattered confidence. Economics shattered sustainability. And the world, moving fast and furiously into a new era, simply left the empire behind. As you drift toward the horizon, watching yet another flag rise above yet another new nation, the realization settles softly around you. This is not collapse. This is transformation. Painful, complicated, overdue, yet unstoppable. And Britain? whether it admits it or not, is already searching for a new identity in the wake of the one it lost. You drift away from the conference rooms where decolonization is signed into being and into the quiet hum of British streets. Narrow terraced rows, damp pavements, shop fronts glowing faintly under a haze of evening drizzle. What was once an empire stretching across continents has folded inward, and now the consequences begin to arrive at Britain's own doorstep, suitcase in hand, tired but hopeful. After the war and throughout the 1950s and 60s, people from across the former empire traveled to the United Kingdom not as subjects, not as colonial labor, but as migrants, seeking work, stability, safety, and opportunity in the very country that once governed their homelands. You find yourself standing on a windy dock at Tilbury in 1948 as the Empire Windrush pulls into port. Hundreds of Caribbean men and women step onto the gangway with strange mixtures of excitement and uncertainty etched across their faces. They hold battered suitcases, musical instruments, children, and dreams that feel both fragile and bold. A mainstream fact settles into your mind. The arrival of the Windrush marks the beginning of large-scale post-war migration to Britain, part of the government's effort to rebuild industry, transportation, and essential services. Historians still argue whether Britain truly anticipated the cultural transformation this wave of migration would bring, or whether policymakers were simply too focused on filling labor shortages to think far beyond the immediate moment. But as you watch the new arrivals squinting at gray skies and listening to chilly winds that seem to whisper, "Welcome, but please bring a thicker coat," you feel something deeper happening. The empire is returning to the metropole, not as a hierarchy, but as a community. You follow a group of Jamaican men to a hostel in Brixton, where they unpack their belongings and crack jokes about English weather. One of them squints at the radiator and asks, "Does this thing work or is it decorative? Like the food?" You laugh, your quirky tidbit for this section, and watch as they warm their hands, ready to start their new lives. Soon, you drift through factories filled with the clatter of machines and the rhythmic steps of workers. Caribbean, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Hong Kong Chinese, Cypriot, Kenyan, Ugandan. They keep the buses running, the hospitals open, the postal routes alive. They rebuild the Britain crushed by war, often doing jobs few local Britons want: night shifts, heavy labor, public sanitation. You sense both gratitude and resentment swirling together in these workspaces, like cream mixing reluctantly into tea. You slip into a small terrace house in Birmingham where an Indian family has converted the downstairs into a warm, spice-filled living room. The scent of cardamom and turmeric hugs your senses, and the radio hums with a mix of BBC broadcasts and crackling Punjabi songs. Neighbors walk past outside, some friendly, some cautious. One elderly British woman brings a plate of biscuits as a welcome gift. Another complains that too many foreigners are arriving. You feel the nation's social fabric stretching, sometimes knitting together, sometimes fraying. A mainstream fact rises in your memory. Britain passes the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act to restrict migration, followed by further acts in 1968 and 1971, each tightening the rules as anxieties grow. Historians still argue whether these laws reflected economic concerns or racial tensions beneath the surface. But from your vantage point, wandering from street to street, you can feel that fear plays a large role. Fear of change, fear of identity loss, fear of the unknown. You walk through London's Notting Hill in the late 1950s, where tensions boil over into violence. Young white men affiliated with the teddy boy subculture clash with Caribbean residents. Bricks fly. Police arrive. Sirens wail. The air tastes like adrenaline and resentment. For a moment, the empire's ghosts seem to grip both sides by the throat. Colonial wounds echoing in metropolitan streets. You wander into a tiny West Indian cafe where music thumps from an old jukebox. Ska, calypso, the kind of rhythm that makes you want to forget heaviness for a few moments. Inside, people talk about the riots with weary frustration. One man stirs his tea and mutters, "They invited us here to rebuild the country," then act surprised when we show up. You nod silently. It's truth wrapped in exhaustion. You slip north to the industrial towns of the Midlands, where South Asian families settle into neighborhoods near factories and textile mills. Women sew clothes at kitchen tables. Children practice multiplication tables under dim lights. Fathers cycle home from night shifts on creaking bicycles. They dream of stability, not glory. And yet, racism greets them. Graffiti, insults, discriminatory housing policies. You see a brick through a window, a racist flyer on a lamppost, a child shrinking away from a shout. The empire may be dissolving, but the prejudices it nurtured linger like shadows in narrow alleyways. Historians still argue whether Britain's lack of an official immigration and integration strategy worsened tensions, or whether no policy could have softened a transition this profound. But as you walk through these neighborhoods, hearing church bells mingle with mosque calls, smelling jerk chicken drifting into the scent of fish and chips, you sense that change is happening organically, chaotically, inevitably. And then there is Northern Ireland. You drift into Belfast, where the air hangs taut with unresolved history. Murals brighten brick walls, some heroic, some grim, some defiant. Catholic Republicans and Protestant Unionists stand divided by more than just ideology. Centuries of contested identity weigh on every street corner. The Troubles ignite in the late 1960s, layering internal conflict atop Britain's global retreat. Bombs shake the streets. Soldiers patrol wary and alert. The conflict stretches across decades. Long, painful, exhausting. A quirky tidbit arises in the form of a local joke. Someone claims Belfast teenagers could identify military vehicles by engine sound alone. An odd, grim badge of expertise nobody should have to develop. You drift between peace walls, tall barricades separating neighborhoods that cannot trust each other, and feel the emotional residue of empire clinging like stubborn fog. This is not a colonial war, not exactly, but it is tied to the legacies of division, governance, favoritism, and identity fostered under imperial rule. As you walk back toward the mainland, catching the ferry across the Irish Sea, Britain feels more complex than at any earlier moment in your journey. The empire has come home, not through conquest, but through migration, not through glory, but through responsibility, not through victory, but through conflict and reconciliation. You arrive once more in London, late at night, the city glowing gold under the street lamps. You see a bus conductor with a Jamaican accent calling stops, a doctor from India walking home after a night shift, a Cypriot baker stretching dough in a warm kitchen, a British carpenter locking his workshop. Lives overlap, cultures mingle, the old empire lingers, not as dominion, but as diversity. Historians still argue whether Britain handled this transformation gracefully or clumsily. But as you walk through these quiet nighttime streets, hearing laughter spill from a Caribbean pub and the soft murmur of a Sikh family closing their shop, you sense that Britain is changing into something new, messy, multicultural, unfinished. And for the first time, perhaps, the island begins to look less like an empire and more like a home shared by the world it once ruled. You leave the lamplit streets of multicultural London behind and feel yourself drawn toward one of the darkest, most complicated chapters of Britain's post-imperial identity. A conflict not in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, but within the British Isles themselves. As the landscape shifts beneath your feet, drizzle becomes pounding rain, street lamps become harsh floodlights, and the familiar pulse of the capital fades into a cold, tense thrum. You step into Northern Ireland at the end of the 1960s, a place where history sits on every doorstep like an unresolved argument. and where the legacy of empire twists inward, transforming into something painfully domestic. The first thing you sense is division. Not ideological, not theoretical, but physical. Walls, fences, barriers, streets that act like borders. You wander through Belfast, where one neighborhood flies the Union Jack, while the next paints murals of Irish heroes, each side marking territory as visibly as nations divided by oceans. Children play beneath watchtowers. Armored Land Rovers groan down narrow streets. The air hums with unease, as though the city holds its breath even when speaking. A mainstream fact settles into your thoughts with sober certainty. The Troubles, beginning in the late 1960s, become a 30-year conflict involving Irish Republican paramilitaries, especially the IRA, loyalist groups, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the British Army. More than 3,500 people die. Tens of thousands are injured. Entire communities fracture. Historians still argue whether the Troubles were a product of colonial legacy, sectarian inequality, British policy, or a centuries-old identity struggle that never healed. But as you walk these damp streets, you feel all of those explanations vibrating at once. You drift into a Catholic neighborhood in West Belfast, where homes sit close together like families huddled against the cold. Posters demand civil rights, fair housing, fair employment, an end to discrimination. Voices rise from community halls. People want equality, not war. And yet, war comes anyway. Then you cross into a Protestant area where Unionist flags snap in the wind. Painted curbs glow red, white, and blue, and murals warn outsiders not to intrude. Many here believe fiercely in remaining part of the United Kingdom and fear that reforms will erase their security. Tension coils like barbed wire between the two communities. Tight, sharp, inevitable. Your quirky tidbit arrives courtesy of a Belfast taxi driver who claims he can tell a passenger's political background by the way they pronounce the word butter. You laugh softly, even as you understand that in a place this divided, even accents become political markers. You drift into the early 1970s and feel the city tighten further. British troops patrol the streets, tense and young, rifles slung from their shoulders. Operation Banner becomes the longest continuous deployment in British military history, another mainstream fact that lands heavy in your chest. Soldiers talk quietly, joking to hide their nerves. One mutters that he's never been so cold while being shot at, which you decide is both darkly funny and deeply unfair. The mood darkens as you walk into the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, 1972. When British soldiers kill 14 unarmed civil rights marchers in Derry. The grief presses in like a physical force. Murals bloom across walls, angry, mournful, defiant. Historians still argue over the motivations, the chain of command, the failures that led to that day. But on the ground, the consequences are brutally clear. Violence escalates, trust disintegrates, communities retreat deeper into fear. You drift past a pub where patrons speak in hushed tones about bombings in London, Birmingham, Guildford. The conflict doesn't stay contained. It reaches into the British mainland, rattling trains, shopping centers, pubs. Ordinary places suddenly thrown into chaos. A man stirs his pint and murmurs, "We're fighting over home, but we're killing far from it." His voice trembles with frustration, grief, and something you can't quite name. Then you slip into the shadow of a peace wall, a towering barrier separating Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods. The wall is scarred with graffiti, pleas for peace, declarations of loyalty, curses etched in thick strokes of spray paint. Children on both sides kick footballs against the same concrete barrier, unaware that their play is mapped by centuries of conflict. A British soldier, young, exhausted, leans against a wall and tells you quietly, "I came here thinking I'd be keeping peace, but most days I feel like I'm just trying not to make anything worse." The earnest uncertainty in his voice lingers with you long after you step away. Historians still argue whether Britain's military presence stabilized Northern Ireland or inflamed the conflict. whether earlier reforms could have prevented escalation, whether diplomacy was delayed too long. But what you feel, walking these nighttime streets, is a society split down the middle, each side convinced of its own pain, its own truth. As you move toward the late 1980s and 1990s, the landscape begins, slowly, haltingly, to soften. Talks begin, ceasefires emerge, hope flickers like a candle in a windstorm. You wander into a community center where Catholic and Protestant children paint murals together under careful supervision. You hear laughter, tentative but real. Then you drift into a quiet room in the 1990s, where negotiators pore over documents, coffee cups, and tired hopes. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 rises slowly from the debris of decades. It is imperfect, fragile, stitched together by compromise and exhaustion, but it brings peace. And as the signatures dry, you feel a collective exhale across Northern Ireland. When you step back into the Belfast night, the air feels different, not healed, but healing. Murals remain, barriers remain, pain remains, but peace holds, stubborn and hopeful, like a hand extended across a long, bitter divide. And as you walk toward the ferry back to mainland Britain, the wind carrying the smell of salt and rain, you sense how deeply the Troubles shaped Britain's internal landscape. Empire once projected outward, now conflict had arrived inward. The old world was gone. A new one, uneasy and diverse, was taking shape. Then, almost quietly, the realization settles over you. Even as Britain faced turmoil at home, small remnants of empire still dotted the world. Gibraltar, Cyprus, Diego Garcia, strategic bases, relics of imperial architecture. They were symbols, not systems, outposts, not dominions. The empire wasn't dead, it was reduced to embers. But soon, even one of its brightest embers would fade, and your journey is pulling you toward that final sunset. You leave the rain-slick streets of Belfast, the weight of decades of conflict still clinging to your clothes, and drift back across the Irish Sea toward the British mainland. But your journey doesn't stop there. It pulls you farther east, across Europe, across deserts, across the wide, restless sweep of the Indian Ocean, toward a city where neon lights glow against a humid sky, and where one of the last great chapters of the British Empire is waiting to close. Hong Kong. As your feet touch the ground, you feel a different sort of electricity in the air. Vibrant, sharp, bustling. Trams rattle past you in a rhythmic clatter. Street stalls sizzle with frying noodles. Businessmen hurry across intersections with briefcases bouncing against their sides. The harbor glitters under the lights of ferries darting between Kowloon and Hong Kong Island like fireflies over dark water. It is alive, confident, modern, yet beneath the surface, a quiet tension hums like a low-frequency vibration. A mainstream fact slips gently into your awareness. On the 1st of July, 1997, after 156 years of British rule, the United Kingdom formally returned Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. Historians still argue whether the handover represented diplomatic pragmatism, unavoidable necessity, or the symbolic final breath of an empire already long gone. But here, in the warm, vibrant night of 1997, you feel the moment before it happens, the strange mixture of celebration, nostalgia, anxiety, and inevitability swirling together. You begin walking the steep streets of Central District, watching as British bobbies stand beside Hong Kong police officers, their uniforms crisp, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable. Red, white, blue bunting flaps weakly in the humid air. It feels festive, yet the mood is fragile. And as you wander among crowds gathered to witness history, you hear snippets of conversation, some hopeful, some nervous, some wistful. Then your quirky tidbit appears in the form of a rumor drifting through the crowd. Someone claims that on the night of the handover, local tailors received a surge of orders from British expatriates wanting one last custom suit made in the colony before it stopped being one. You picture a tailor frantically hemming trousers at 11:58 p.m., because a diplomat demanded a symbolic souvenir. The image makes you smile, softly, sadly. You drift into the governor's house, where Chris Patten, Britain's final governor of Hong Kong, walks slowly through hallways he will soon leave forever. Papers are sorted, boxes sealed. Aides speak in hushed tones. Patten looks tired, dignified, and very human, his steps echoing in rooms that once housed a different kind of authority. He pauses near a window overlooking the harbor, taking in the city he administered, defended, and ultimately had to relinquish. Historians still argue whether Britain should have negotiated differently, whether Hong Kong's future could have been assured more firmly, or whether the realities of geopolitics left no room for alternatives. But watching Patten's silhouette against the shimmering harbor, you sense that this moment is less about diplomatic documents and more about a nation reckoning with the last tangible piece of its imperial identity. The night deepens. Rain begins to fall, light, then heavy, then torrential, as though the sky itself is marking the transition. Crowds open umbrellas. Journalists wipe water off their cameras. Soldiers from the People's Liberation Army wait at the border, engines idling softly, headlights cutting through the mist. You walk toward the Convention and Exhibition Center, where the ceremony hums with anticipation. Flags stand ready. Officials sit stiffly in their seats. Musicians tune their instruments. The hall is cool, air-conditioned, precise. Time feels suspended, as though you're standing in the space between two breaths. And then, midnight approaches. A hush spreads across the cavernous hall, quiet as snowfall. You watch the Union Jack rise and fall one final time, its colors bright against the stage lights. The Hong Kong colonial flag, with its iconic crest, lowers beside it. A soft rustle passes through the crowd, the sound of hundreds exhaling simultaneously. For a moment, the hall is utterly still. Then the Chinese flag ascends, red and bold. In that instant, you feel something immense, a symbolic weight finally setting itself down after centuries of restless motion. The British Empire, already fragmented, already transformed, already humbled, now releases its last major possession. Not through war, not through rebellion, not through sudden collapse, but through ceremony, paperwork, and rain. Outside, in the wet night air, fireworks crackle over Victoria Harbor. Crowds cheer. Others remain silent. Some hold candles. Some hold cameras. Some hold nothing but memories. You wander through squares and alleyways, listening to fragments of emotion. What now? History is changing. We'll see. The voices blur into a gentle murmur as you drift toward the Star Ferry Pier. The rain softens. Neon lights shimmer on slick pavement like watercolor strokes. A British naval vessel waits in the harbor to carry Patten away. You stand on the pier as the governor boards with his family, their steps slow, deliberate. The ship glides into the night as bagpipes play. Haunting, mournful, beautiful. The music drifts across the water like a farewell whispered into the dark. Historians still argue whether this was Britain's dignified exit or its final capitulation. But as you feel the vibrations of the ship fade into distance, you realize the label doesn't matter. This is the closing of a story. Britain's empire didn't end with a bang, nor with a final battle, nor with a triumphant march home. It ended with ceremony, rain, and a lingering question. Who is Britain? Without the empire that once defined it, you sense that the answer is still unfolding. In the multicultural streets of London, in the lingering tensions of Northern Ireland, in the quiet presence of remaining overseas territories, in trade agreements and diplomatic alliances, in memories, regrets, triumphs, and the slow rewriting of a national identity once built on global domination. The empire is gone. Britain remains. And the nation continues trying to understand what that means. Now, as the echoes of that final ceremony fade and the harbor lights dim into soft reflections on the water, let yourself drift a little. Slow your breathing. Soften your shoulders. The long journey through centuries of rise and fall, hope and conflict, pride and reckoning, begins to loosen its grip. We've walked through humid jungles and crowded bazaars, through quiet committee rooms and noisy city streets, through celebrations and crises, all the way to that rainy night in Hong Kong when history gently closed a door. Let yourself relax into the rhythm of the present moment. The world becomes quieter here, the images softer, the sounds lower and warmer. You can almost feel a gentle breeze rolling off the harbor, cool, steady, comforting. The kind of breeze that reminds you that stories end, but life continues in quieter, calmer ways. Imagine the lights of Hong Kong slowly blurring into a soft glow, the rainfall turning into a steady hush like white noise wrapping around you. The ship carrying Britain's last governor moves farther into darkness until it becomes just a shimmer, and then nothing at all. And with that, the weight of empire seems to ebb away, leaving behind only gentle ripples that fade into stillness. Whatever burdens you carried into this story can drift out with the tide now. Let them loosen and dissolve, the way the empire itself dissolved into time. You don't need to hold anything. You don't need to think about anything. Just breathe, slowly and deeply, and let the narrative settle into quiet memory. You are safe. You are calm. And the world, for this moment, is beautifully still.